two are conversing." At that, Adams turned from the window to face Brose. Lindblom, too, turned toward the monster concoction wedged somehow into the chair at the desk. "Not conversing," Adams said to Brose. "Just meditating." On Lindblom's face there was no expression, only empty, stone-like detachment. He had been given a task. He intended to do it. He recommended to Adams by his manner that Joseph Adams do the same. But suppose it were not Runcible. Suppose it were someone else. Then this entire project, the faked artifacts, the articles in Natural World, the leak of the find, the litigation before the Recon Dis-In Council, the destruction of Runcible's economic empire and his imprisonment. It was all for nothing. Joseph Adams trembled, because unlike Brose, unlike Vern Lindblom, and probably Robert Higg and anyone and everyone else connected with this project, he had a dreadful intuition that it was all a mistake. And his intuition was not going to halt the project, not one bit. Again, turning his back to Brose, Adams said, "Lindblom, they may be wrong. It may not be Runcible." There was no answer. Lindblom could not respond because he was at the moment facing Brose, who, now on his feet, was waddling and groping his way, supported by a magnesium crutch, toward the office door, mumbling as he departed. "Honest to God," Adams said, staring fixedly out the window, "I'll write the articles, but if it isn't him, I'm going to tip him off." He turned toward Lindblom, tried to read his reaction. It was not there to read, but Lindblom had heard. The reaction would come, sooner or later. Joseph Adams knew this man, this personal friend, had worked with him enough to be sure of it. It would be a strong reaction. After a great deal of soul-searching, Vern Lindblom would probably agree, probably help him find a way of tipping off Runcible, without leaving a trail back to the source that Brose's agents could trace. Brose's agents and the private hired talents of the footmen operating in conjunction. On the other hand, he had to face it, was facing it. Vern Lindblom was a Yance man fundamentally, before and beyond any other consideration. His reaction might be to report Adams' statement to Brose. The agents of Brose would then, within minutes, show up at Joseph Adams' domain and kill him. It was that simple. And at the moment there was no way he could tell which direction his longtime friend Lindblom would jump. Adams did not possess the services of an international psychiatric profile analysis organization, as Brose did. He could only wait and pray. And prayer, he thought caustically, went out 20 years ago, even before the war. The field technician of the private police corporation, Webster Foote Limited, crouched in his cramped bunker and said into his odd receiver which transmitted to headquarters in London, "Sir, I have on tape a two-way conversation." "On the same matter we discussed?" Webster Foote's voice came, distantly. "Evidently." "All right. You know who's the acting contact with Louis Runcible. See that he gets it." "I'm sorry to say that this..." "Convey it anyhow. We do what we can with what we have." The far-off voice of Webster Foote was authoritative. This, coming from him, was a pronouncement of judgment as well as an order. "Yes, Mr. Foote. S.A.P." "Indeed," Webster Foote agreed. "Soon as possible." And in London at his end, he broke the odd transmission. The Webster Foote Limited field technician turned at once back to his banks of detection and recording apparatuses, economically operating at low gain but satisfactory output level. He examined the visual, graphic tapes, appearing ceaselessly to be certain that during the odd contact with his superior he had missed nothing. Now was not the time to miss anything. He had not. 7. And meanwhile, the superb hand-wrought speech, untouched, remained in Joseph Adams' briefcase. Lindblom remained, shakily lighting a cigarette and trying not to involve himself, for the moment, in further conversation. He had had enough. He remained because he was too exhausted to go. "You have it in your power," Adams said as he seated himself at his desk, opened his briefcase and got out his speech, "to get me picked off." "I know." Lindblom muttered. Walking toward the door, Adams said, I'm going to vac this, get it to the SIM and on tape, and then to hell with it. Then, what do we call the new project, this forging of non-Terran artifacts to put a man in prison whose whole life is devoted to seeing that decent housing is... The Nazis, Lindblom interrupted, had no written orders regarding the final solution, the genocide of the Jews. It was done orally, told by superior to subordinate, handed down by word of mouth. If you don't object to an absurd mixed metaphor, you probably do. Let's go have a cup of coffee, Adams said. Lindblom shrugged. What the hell? They've decided it's Runcible. Who are we to say it isn't? Show me. Conjure up someone else who would benefit by tipping off tanks. I'd be glad to, Adams said, and saw Lindblom look disconcerted. Any one of the thousands of tankers living in Runcible's connefs. All it would take would be one who got away, wasn't picked up by Bros's agents or footmen, made his way back to his own ant tank. Then, from it, contacted a neighboring tank. Then from that tank to... Yeah, Lindblom agreed, stolidly. Sure, why not? Except, would his fellow tankers let him back into his tank? Wouldn't they think he was hot or had, what name did we make up to call it? The bag plague. They'd massacre him on sight, because they believe the reading matter we give them on TV every damn day of the week and twice on Saturday night, just in case. They'd think he was a living missile. And anyhow, there's more you don't know. You ought to hand over a few bucks to the Foot organization now and then. Pick up a little inside news. These tankers that had been tipped off about conditions up here, they weren't tipped off by anybody they knew. It wasn't one of their own members coming back. Okay, the tanker couldn't reach his own tank, so instead, they got it, Lindblom said, over the coax. For a moment, Adams failed to understand. He stared at Lindblom. That's right, Lindblom said. On their TV set, for about 1 minute, and very feeble, but enough. Good God, Adams said, and he thought, there are millions of them down there. What would it be like if someone cut into the main coax, the chief, sole, and central trunk from Estes Park that reaches all the tanks? What would it be like to have the Earth open and millions of humans, imprisoned subsurface for 15 years, believing in a radioactive waste above, with missiles and bacteria and rubble and warring armies? The domain system would sustain a death blow, and the great park over which he flapped twice daily would become a densely populated civilization once more. Not quite as before the war, but close enough. Roads would reappear, cities, and ultimately there would be another war. That was the rationale. The masses had egged their leaders on to war in both West Dam and Pack Peep. But once the masses were out of the way, stuffed down below into antiseptic tanks, the ruling elite of both East and West were free to conclude a deal. Although strangely, in a sense, it had not been them at all. Not Bros, not General Holt, who had been C&C of West Dam, or even Marshal Herenzany, the top officer in the hierarchy of Soviet brass. But the fact that both Holt and Herenzany knew when it was time to use the missiles, and had done so, and when time had come to quit, this was all true, and without it, without their joint reasonability, peace would not have been possible. But underneath this collaboration of the two top military men lay something else. Something which to Adams was real and strange, and in a sense, deeply moving. The Recon Dis-In Council of Leadys in Mexico City, Meca. It had assisted in the job of forcing peace on the planet, and as a governing body, a final arbiter, it had not gone away. Man had built a weapon that could think for itself, and after it had thought a while, 2 years in which vile destruction had occurred, with the leadys locked hip and thigh each with the other, two huge artificial armies from two land masses, advanced varieties of leadys, who had been constructed with an eye toward utilizing their analytical brains for planning tactics and finally overall strategy. These advanced types, the 10, 11, and 12 varieties, had figured out that the best strategy was something which the Phoenicians had learned 5,000 years ago. It was summed up, Adams reflected, in the Mikado. If merely saying that a man had been executed was enough to satisfy everyone, Why not merely say it instead of doing it? The problem was really, to the advanced leadys, that simple. They were not Gilbert and Sullivan buffs, and Gilbert's words were not in their artificial brains. The text of the Mikado had not been programmed into them as operational data, but they had arrived at the same conclusion, and had in addition acted on it in conjunction with Marshal Lorenzini and C&C General Holt. Aloud, Adams said, "But they didn't see the advantage." "Pardon?" Lindblom murmured, still shaky, still unwilling to engage in any more talk. He looked tired. "What the Recon Dis-End Council didn't see," Adams said, "and can't see now, because there's no libido component to their percept-mentation systems, is that the maxim, 'Why execute someone?'" "Ah, shut up," Lindblom said, and turning, stalked out of Joseph Adams' office, leaving him standing there alone, speech in hand, idea in mind, doubly frustrated. But he could hardly blame Lindblom for being upset, because all the Yance men had this streak. They were selfish. They had made the world into their deer park at the expense of the millions of tankers below. It was wrong, and they knew it, and they felt guilt. Not quite enough guilt to cause them to knock off Gross and let the tankers up, but enough guilt to make their late evenings a thrashing agony of loneliness, emptiness, and their nights impossible. And they knew that if anyone could be said to be amending the crime committed, the theft of an entire planet from its rightful owners, it was Louis Runcible. They gained by keeping the tankers down, and he gained by luring them up. The Yance men elite confronted Runcible as an antagonist, but one whom they knew deep down inside was morally in the right. It was not a sanguine feeling, at least not to Joe Adams, as he stood alone in his office, gripping his superb speech, which was to be zapped, run through the sand, taped, then castrated from Brose's office. This speech, it did not tell the truth, but it was not a pastiche of cliches, lies, bromides, euphemisms, and more sinister ingredients, which Adams had noticed in speeches dreamed up by his fellow Yance men. After all, he was only one speechwriter from among a pack. Carrying his highly prized new speech, so regarded by him anyhow, in the absence of a contrary consensual validation, he left his office, and by express elevator dropped to the floor where Megavac 6B chugged away. Floors, rather, in that the total works of the organism had undergone accretive changes over the years. Refinements that had added to it whole new parts occupying entire new layers. Megavac 6V was huge, but in contrast the sim itself remained the same as always. Two uniformed toughs, Gross's hand-picked but oddly effete, physiognomically dainty roughnecks, eyed him as he emerged from the elevator. They knew him. They understood that his presence on Megavac 6V's programming floor was mandatory in view of his job. He approached the keyboard of Megavac 6V, saw that it was in use. Another Yance man, unfamiliar to him, was whacking away at the keys like a virtuoso pianist at the end of a Franz Liszt opus, with double octaves and all. Everything but hammering with the fist. Above the Yance man, his written copy was suspended, and Adams gave in to the impulse. He moved close to inspect it. At once, the Yance man ceased typing. "Sorry," Adams said. "Let's see your authorization." The Yance man, quite dark, youthful, and small, with almost Mexican-like hair, held out his hand peremptorily. Sighing, Adams got out of his briefcase the memo from Geneva, from Brose's bureau, entitling him to vac this particular speech. The document had a stamped code number, entered on the memo as well. The dark, small Yance man compared the document with the memo, seemed satisfied, returned both to Adams. "I'll be through in 40 minutes. The youth resumed typing. "So bounce off and leave me alone." His tone was neutral, but forbidding. Adams said, "I rather like your style." He had briefly scanned the page of script on top. It was good stuff. Again, the Yance man ceased typing. "You're Adams." Once more he extended his hand, this time for shaking purposes. They shook then, and the strained atmosphere reduced to a tolerable level. But there was always the I'm-bigger-than-you competitiveness in the air when two Yancemen met, away from the agency or at their domains or here right on the job. It always made the day just that much tougher to get through, and yet Adams thrived on it. If not, he realized, he would long since have gone under. "You've done some good pieces. I've watched the final tapes." Studying him with his sharp, bright, black, deeply set Mexican-type eyes, the young Yanceman said, "But a lot of your work has been axed at Geneva, or so I hear." "Well," Adams said stoically, "it's either axed or it's coaxed in this business. There's no such thing as half-transmitting. You want to bet?" The youth's tone was brittle, penetrating. It disconcerted Adams. Guardedly, because, after all, both of them, in essence, were competing for the same prize, Adams said, "I suppose a jejune, watered-down speech could be considered. Let me show you something." The dark young Yanceman rose, yanked shut the master circuit breaker so that the vac began processing what he had fed it up to now. Together, Adams and the dark young Yanceman walked over to view the SIM. There it sat, solemnly at its large oak desk, with the American flag behind it. In Moscow, another and identical SIM sat, with a duplicate of Megavac 6B, the flag of the USSR, behind it. Otherwise everything, the clothes, the gray hair, the competent, fatherly, mature but soldierly features, the strong chin. It was the same SIM all over again, both having been built simultaneously in Germany, wired by the finest Yancemen technicians alive. And here maintenance men perpetually skulked, watching with trained, narrow eyes for any sign of failure, even a fraction of a second hesitation. Anything which might mitigate the quality striven for, that of free and easy authenticity. This simulacrum, out of all which they, the Yancemen, were involved in, required the greatest semblance of the actuality which it mimicked. A breakdown here, Adams realized soberly, however minute, would be catastrophic. Like the time its left hand, in reaching out, a huge red warning light on the wall lit, a buzzer buzzed. A dozen Maine men for the simulacrum materialized to scrutinize. Catastrophic, as the time the reaching left hand went into a spasm of pseudo-Parkinsonism, a neural motor tremor, indicating, had the tapes been put on the cable, the insidious start of senility. Yes, that would have been the tanker's interpretation, most probably. "He's getting old," they would have muttered to each other as they sat in their communal halls overseen by their polycoms. "Look, he's shaky. The strain. Remember Roosevelt? The strain of the war got him finally. It'll get the protector. And then what'll we do?" But it hadn't been put on the coaxial cable, of course. The tankers had never seen that sequence. The SIM had been opened up, thoroughly gone over, tested and checked and certified. A miniaturized component had been spat on, denounced as the malefactor. And at a workbench in one of the shops of Runcibal's Conneps, a workman had been quietly relieved of his duties and possibly his life, without ever knowing why or what. Because in the first place, he had known what the tiny output coil or diode or just plain thing had been used for. The SIM began to move. And Joseph Adams shut his eyes, standing as he was out of range of the cameras, hidden with his small, dark, very young but expert Yanceman, the author of the words about to be uttered. Maybe it'll go out of its mind, Adams thought wildly, and began to recite pornographic ballads. Or like one of those antique disc records of the previous century. Repeat a word, repeat a word, repeat a word. "My fellow Americans," the SIM said in its firm, familiar, near hoarse but utterly controlled voice. Himself, Joseph Adams said, "Yes, Mr. Yanson. Yes, sir." 8. Joseph Adams listened to the partial text of the speech up to the point where the dark young Yanceman had ceased feeding the script to the vac, and then, when the SIM became rigid and the cameras, at the precise moment, shut down, he turned to the man beside him, the author, and said, "I take my hat off to you. You're good." He had almost been captured himself as he had stood watching the simulacrum of the protector Talbot Yancey, delivered with absolutely the proper intonation in the exact and correct manner, The text, modified and augmented, meddled with, by Megavac 6V from what it had received. Even though he could see Megavac 6V, and although this was not visible, could sense the emanation of the reading matter directed by the vac toward the simulacrum. Could in fact witness the true source which animated the purely artificial construct seated at the oak desk with the American flag behind it. Eerie, he thought. But a good speech is a good speech, whoever delivers it. A kid in high school reciting Tom Paine. The material is still great, and this reciter doesn't falter or stumble or get the words wrong. The vac and all these Maine men standing around see to that. And, he thought, so do we. We know what we're doing. Who are you? He asked the strangely capable young Yance man. Dave something, I forget, the man said, almost mystically absorbed, even now that the sim had become inoperative once more. You forget your name? Puzzled, he waited, and then he realized that this was merely an elliptical way by which the dark young man was telling him something. That he was a relatively new Yance man, not yet fully established in the hierarchy. Lantano, Adams said. You're David Lantano, living in the hot spot near Cheyenne. That's right. No wonder you're black. Radiation burned, Adams realized. The youth, eager to acquire land for a domain, had gone in too soon. All the rumors, passed back and forth in the idle hours of evening by the worldwide elite, appeared true. It had been far too soon, and physically young David Lantano was suffering. Philosophically, Lantano said, I'm alive. But look at you. What about your bone marrow? Tests show there's not too much impairment of red cell production. I expect to recuperate, and it's cooling daily. I've gotten over the worst part. Wryly, Lantano said, You should come and visit me, Adams. I've had my leadys working night and day. The villa itself is almost complete. Adams said, I wouldn't go into the Cheyenne hot spot for a pile of postgrads 10 miles high. That speech of yours shows how much you can contribute. Why risk your health, your life? You could stay here in New York City, live in a connept of the agency until, Lantano said, the Cheyenne hotspot cooled down enough in 10 years, 15 years, and then someone grabbed it ahead of me. My only chance, he was saying, in other words, was deliberately to go in prematurely, as has been attempted in the past by Yance men in the exact same position before me. And so often those premature investments, those hasty, anxious entries into still hot areas meant death. And not a mercifully quick death, but a gruesome, slow deterioration over a period of years. Viewing the dark, in truth, severely scorched youth, Adams realized how fortunate he himself was to be fully established. His villa was long built, his grounds were fully planted, green throughout, and he had entered the West Coast hotspot south of San Francisco at a safe time. He had relied on footmen reports, bought at great cost, and look how it had all worked out, in contrast to this. Lantano would have his fine villa, his vast stone building made out of the rubble, the concrete that had been the city of Cheyenne, but Lantano would be dead, and that, according to the Recon Dis-In Council's ruling, put the area up for grabs once again. It would be a rush by eager Yanchmen to get in and acquire what Lantano had left behind. An ultimate end to Adams' pathetic irony. The youth's villa, built at such cost, at the expense of his life, would go to someone else who did not have to build, supervise a gang of leadys day after day. I presume, Adams said, that you get the hell out of Cheyenne as often as is legal. 12 out of every 24 hours, according to Recon Dis-In Council law, had to be spent within the new domain area. I come here, I work, as you see me now. Lantano returned to the keyboard of Megavac 6V. Adams trailed after him. As you say, Adams, I have a job to do. I expect to live to perform it. Once more, Lantano seated himself at the keyboard, facing his copy. Well, at least it hasn't impaired your mind, Adams said. Smiling, Lantano said, Thanks. For 1 hour, Joseph Adams stood by while Lantano fed his speech to Megavac 6B. And when he had read it all, and then, as it emerged from the back of the sim, had heard it actually delivered by the dignified, gray-haired father figure Talbot Yancey himself, he felt overwhelmingly the futility of his own speech. The dreadful contrast. What he himself gripped in his briefcase was beginner's prattle. He felt like slinking away into oblivion. Where does a barely grown, radiation-burned, unestablished new Yance man get such ideas, Adams asked himself, and the ability to express them, and the know-how as to exactly what the VAC's treatment of the copy would result in, how it would ultimately emerge as spoken by the sim before the cameras? Didn't it take years to learn this? It had taken him years to learn what he knew. To write a sentence and, after examining it, know approximately, that is sufficiently accurately, how it would in its turn